Hi all, my name is Ryan and welcome to my channel What the Pop, where we discuss pop culture in general and Buffy a lot, and quite a few things queer. If you like Buffy or queer pop culture, click like, subscribe and the notification bell for more of these videos. Now, it's no secret that I love Heartstopper. This is now the 4th video on my channel about it. If you haven't seen my others, there's a Season 1 analysis, a How Heartstopper is Healing My Teenage Trauma video, and a Heartstopper quiz. I'll put links to them all in the description below so you can check them out. On Heartstopper, Alice Oseman, the author, said in an interview, "For me, it's just about celebrating queer joy. Above all, I hope that it just makes people smile and brightens their day. But I also hope that it inspires, particularly young queer people, to believe they can find happiness and find romance and find friendship." The joy it is bringing people has made Heartstopper a worldwide phenomenon. That hopeful message and healing power, coupled with the melancholy that it creates, that I talk about in my Healing Teenage Trauma video, has resonated everywhere. It currently has a 100% critic rating on Rotten Tomatoes. All volumes of the graphic novel hit the New York Times best-selling list, as well as other books set in the same universe, also written by the author. It has been renewed by Netflix for another 2 seasons, something almost unprecedented for Netflix to do. It's a breath of fresh air in queer storytelling, because so many queer stories focus on trauma, because the reality is that trauma features heavily in most queer people's lives in some form or another. And not just trauma in general, but specifically trauma related to the queer experience. That fear of being outed, of potentially being rejected by parents and friends, getting kicked out of home, and in some cases experiencing violence, both mental and physical. A good example of this is Jake Gyllenhaal's character Jack Twist in Brokeback Mountain. We see the love growing between Jack and Heath Ledger's character Ennis Delmar. We see them get found out a number of times, seen by the man that employed them, and seen by Ennis's wife. Near the end of the movie, when Ennis calls to ask about Jack, we find out that Jack is dead. His wife, played by Anne Hathaway, tells Ennis that he died changing a tyre, that it had exploded. But the visuals show he was beaten and left for dead by men who presumably discovered he was gay. The traumatic experience, particularly being attacked for being gay, became an expectation of gay storytelling. And if it wasn't physical violence, it was an AIDS scare, or a drug crisis, or being kicked out of home and the struggle that went with it. The stories were seldom about hope, they were seldom about happiness. It always seemed to focus on a shared trauma that all queer people have and pretty much expect now from queer storytelling. The sad reality for queer people is traumatic stories, although often heartbreaking, ring true because we've all had them, as it is most queer people's lived experience. As Charlie said, "Don't worry about it, I'm used to it." Even movies that are more upbeat, more hopeful, still find themselves mired in these traumatic events. Take The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, as an example. Although it is mostly upbeat, joyful and hopeful, and with an optimistic and dare I say happy ending, the characters do experience moments of homophobia. The bus gets graffitied with homophobic slurs, and in another example of homophobic violence, Guy Pearce's character Adam is attacked in a country town. These specifically queer traumas seem almost inescapable in queer storytelling. It is with this trauma, both experienced and embedded in queer storytelling, that queer people, and anyone who has watched more than one queer story, approaches Heartstopper. And it's because of this trauma that we experience what I call intrusive expectation at various points in the show. Intrusive expectation is when you are approaching a point in a show or book, and because of past lived trauma or past experience with stories of this nature, you expect the character to have a negative outcome. This negative expectation can manifest in a number of ways, but most commonly it's an apprehension for the character's mental and physical well-being that intrudes upon the experience of the story itself. This kind of expectation is foundational to other storytelling genres. Horror, for example, is built on these expectations. In horror, the scare comes because we are unsure of who is going to die, who the killer is going to get next. So the genre is built on building this level of apprehension in the audience. But the difference between horror and queer stories is that in horror it is intentional. You go into a horror story expecting that level of apprehension, of expecting a negative outcome for most of the characters. Often what differentiates a good horror from a bad horror is how well they develop, subvert and manipulate that expectation. Queer storytelling, however, shouldn't have that apprehension as an expectation simply because it is a queer story. But decades of queer storytelling have made that expectation a reality. When you consume a queer story, you go in wondering which specifically queer trauma the main character is going to experience. Are they going to get bashed for being gay? Are they going to get outed and lose their job? Are they going to have an AIDS scare? Are they going to get thrown out of home? And this is a disservice to queer people in general because we are more than our trauma. Like the straight experience, the gay experience is rich and diverse. There is joy and hope. There's family, community and belonging. There's power, triumph and success. And love. There is so much love. While many of us have suffered trauma, it's not the only story worth telling from a queer perspective. So when you do get queer storytelling that doesn't have this trauma as a central focus, or barely even a plot point, you get moments of intrusive expectation. You feel that apprehension for a character. And when that traumatic event doesn't materialize, you feel this great sense of relief. I call it intrusive expectation rather than apprehensive expectation for two reasons. One, apprehensive expectation is a term they apparently use to define worry in diagnosing anxiety disorders, and I don't want to confuse the two. And two, it describes exactly how this expectation detracts from the viewing experience by intruding on the narrative. We can take the most prominent example from Heartstopper to show how it manifests. After the boys emerge from the cinema, Harry is teasing Charlie and Charlie leaves. Nick goes after him and apologises, saying they should have just left. Charlie says he's honestly used to it now and that he'll see him in school. Nick goes back inside to confront Harry. As Charlie continues walking through the car park, we see someone approach him and almost immediately we know it's Ben, but that doesn't matter. And this is where intrusive expectation kicks in, where it interrupts our experience of this story. Because anyone who has ever watched a queer show or read a queer story suddenly fears for Charlie. Because we believe he's about to be physically assaulted for being gay. That inherent fear that he's in danger kicks in because we expect it. Ben confronts him about Nick and asks if they're dating. Charlie denies it even though Ben saw them holding hands. Ben says he's never wanted Charlie, he just felt sorry for him. And although Ben is cruel, we all know it's because he's struggling with his sexuality and that he does want Charlie, but doesn't even have the balls to be seen with him. And then Charlie's dad arrives, and we get this immense wave of relief that Charlie didn't suffer the physical assault that decades of queer storytelling had led us to believe he would. Although there are other examples of where it could happen in Heartstopper, anyone who has read the webcomic or the books from that comic would know the outcome of most of those situations, so that apprehension is somewhat lessened. The reason this one is the most prominent example in Heartstopper is because it was a new moment. It was something that didn't happen in the comics, so we had no indication how the scene would play out. It would have been very easy for the producers to make this a stereotypical queer trauma scene. So even when you have a show like Heartstopper that doesn't centre around queer trauma, you can see how intrusive expectation affects the viewing experience. Now, intrusive expectation isn't limited to queer storytelling. For example, if you had that same scene in a heterosexual context, say Charlie was a girl, I can guarantee that as Ben approached Charlie, a number of women watching that scene would have experienced that same apprehension over a potential sexual assault. So why then am I highlighting it in queer storytelling? Well, the difference is that in the context of the show, that of a teen love story, if this were a heteronormative narrative, you'd expect that Ben would be declaring his love for Charlie, throwing his hat in the ring, having seen that he now has competition in Nick. It would become that typical rom-com situation of two boys fighting over the female protagonist. In the context of a teen love story, you wouldn't expect a sexual assault, so that intrusive expectation would be somewhat limited. As I said before, this is not the case with queer storytelling, where there is an assumption of trauma in the narrative. It is almost as if it can't be an authentic queer narrative without that trauma. A story like Heartstopper shows this isn't the case. It is entirely possible to tell an authentic queer story without it centering around queer trauma. So how then do we get past this? How then do we make it so intrusive expectation isn't part of the queer storytelling experience going forward? The answer is simple, and only two things are required: more diverse storytelling and time. As queer stories become more diverse and don't revolve around queer traumatic experiences, that intrusive expectation of a potential traumatic moment will lessen over time. Shows like Heartstopper are a blueprint for doing that well. Thanks for watching. If you like what I do, please like, subscribe and click the notification bell to be notified whenever I upload a new video. Or consider supporting the channel through our Patreon. If you think I missed anything or have any further comments, put them in the comments below and I'll see you next video.